Okay, so today we're going to talk through exercise 128, but it's also kind of the last non-demonstration lecture that I'll give this semester because I want to talk about portfolios one more time. And so you guys remember back, I did a whole lecture on portfolios and we talked about layouts and what to include and what's good and what's bad and that sort of thing the last time we talked about the portfolios. This time I'm going to focus instead on a bunch of portfolio covers and try to talk through what's a good thing to put on your cover, what looks good, what doesn't look good, that sort of thing. We'll also talk about binding options because lo and behold, we go on Thanksgiving break, then you come back, and all of a sudden the semester's over, right? So there's not a lot of time left. The portfolio, just as a reminder, is worth 30% of your overall grade, so it's definitely important. The worst thing that you can do is leave it to the last minute and throw it together. I've seen people who thought they were going to do really well in the class and did a very poor job on their portfolio and it dropped their grade. And that happens. So it's not something that you want to ignore or pretend doesn't exist. You want to actually work on it. And you want to have a good product at the end. In the back on the table, I have sample portfolios from previous years, some of which go back a ways, maybe 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. But they're all good examples of portfolios that students in your shoes have done. And so those are oftentimes useful. The pictures that I'm going to show today of covers are just from the internet at large, so they're not necessarily pertinent to you specifically, but at the same time they show a lot about what portfolios are and what generally is included on a cover. So we'll start, and I kind of broke these into categories. The first category is the text-only portfolio. Blank page with a little bit of text. And some of these examples include a little bit of a logo, but essentially this is architecture portfolio, the name of the person, and they put their little logo there. But it's very plain, very simple, just good typography. And one of the critical things about doing this kind of a layout is what font do you pick? What size font do you pick? Is the spacing between letters appropriate? Are the colors appropriate? Did you bold part of it? Did you not bold part of it? All of that typographic stuff becomes absolutely critical because there's nothing else on the page that stands out. So you really want to think carefully. Do you center the text in the middle of the page? Do you put it off to one side? Do you use the rules of composition? How does that play into account? So if we look at this one, for example, right, we have a strong line right in the center here that divides architecture and portfolio, divides first name and last name. Right? So it's focused right on that center point of this particular image. The left side here, bold and bold. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with making your first name bold instead of your last name bold, but you kind of have to think about that. I think if I were doing this, maybe architecture and first name would both be the lighter weight font, and the bold font would be portfolio and last name. Right? But again, that's a personal preference, and you want to think about that because those are the details that matter when you're working on a portfolio cover that has just text. Right? So let's move on to the next example. Right? Very clean, very plain. Right? Name, what the person is. All right? In this case, it's interior architect. I think this is just the cover. I don't think there's any pages in this yet. And this, we'll get to bindings a little bit later on, but this is an example of binding. One of the things that in this particular context that's been done is the text color matches the binding interior, right? So there's a little bit of subtlety there, but there's nothing else on the page. It's plain white. Okay? Sometimes, depending on where you, like let's say you're using your portfolio to apply to grad school. Sometimes they require that you put information on your portfolio cover. So, Grant Adams, architecture program, option 2 candidate, or something like that. Right? That happened to be mine when I had to do it. So sometimes there is required information that needs to be included. Right? Another example here, we've got kind of the scribbled signature. It works compositionally nice. Notice, though, that the name is in the lower right corner in this layout. So it's not in the center. They've deliberately chosen it to be off-center. Very carefully considered text in addition to the little signature. Okay? Again, we go back to centered, right? The logo becomes a little bit more pertinent, more prominent. In this case, the logo is kind of a graphic element. It happens to be a nice logo. It's clean. It's well done. So it works. but again, very thin font, carefully designed, and there's definitely a hierarchy as part of this. Notice in the lower left corner, you might not be able to see it from the back, we've got phone number and email, right? That might be relevant, it might not be relevant. So again, you're in control of what's shown on a particular page. Okay? So another example here. To me, the font gets a little too small. It's a little too hard to read. If I have this blown up on a screen and it's this large, and I can still barely read architectural portfolio, think about it in its smaller context. It'd be very difficult to read that. So you want to make sure that what you're presenting is actually going to work, right? Other than that, I think it's kind of a creative, nice cover. We introduce a little bit of color, big swash of color, architecture, folio, right? Combination of the color being used under folio, portfolio, short, or the name of the person, right? And then we have a little tagline down at the bottom, creativity, simple, detail. Okay? So you're introducing color, but again, it's still only text, right? Other than that dividing line, right? So let's move forward. We'll take the text and we'll start to put in a little bit of background. A lot of these are still very much text-based, but they've introduced a little photograph or something as part of the background. And the question is, what is the piece that serves as the background? So we've got the person's name, design portfolio, again, carefully considered font choice, right? And then we have this image that we don't really know what it is, but it's kind of architectonic in a way. It looks like it's part model. Okay, it's kind of interesting. Okay, very abstract. It's not a telltale of this is my work, this is my project. It's just, probably he built this at some point, but we don't really know much about it. So it might be providing some interest, right? The mesh corner example, right? Those kinds of things. Again, abstract, you're not really sure what it is, but it's something. In this case, it's the splattered ink. This is showing up really dark. It has a little bit of a wood grain pattern behind it. I think the portfolio with the splattered ink is nicely done. The person's name that's kind of stuck on with the really weird shadow doesn't feel right to me. It feels too fake or too synthetic. A little too much drop shadow or something. So it's just something to be aware of. And when you're considering your portfolio, how do you want it to present itself? I mean, in this kind of a casual thing, it would feel better if it was written like on a piece of masking tape that was taped on or something. It's fighting the casualness of that. So the simple brushed, right, aluminum background, again, photographic background, it's just a texture. It's essentially a white page, only it has a little bit of texture on it, or essentially a gray page. Okay? Again, very carefully considered font choice and how that represents. Lower corner, it's a little bit weighted. The proportions of this portfolio is skinny and tall. So it's a little different than the normal proportions that people tend to use. So be aware that those kinds of things impact your decision. Right? To me, this is very difficult to read. It's certainly creative, and I can kind of figure out that it says portfolio, but it's a little weird. Right? So the question is, does this enhance your desire to want to look at this portfolio, or do you say, what in the hell is this? What's your reaction to it? And so you, as the designer, want to think about that. And are you presenting something that makes people want to read it, or are you trying to get them to get excited about it, or be frustrated by it, or what? Okay. Something like this. This is done in a lot of architectural portfolios. This is the blueprint background, the working drawings, the technical drawing background, right? It works fine for somebody who wants a drafting technical background job. If you're looking for a design job, something like this might not be that relevant, right? And you want to think about, do you include it, do you not include it? It's kind of like the cover that has the rolls of plans on it, right? It's kind of generic, but it's certainly something that people do, and it works. But again, there's just a very simple text, right? I actually think this cover is done in aluminum, so the material is changed from the traditional, paper cover to a thin aluminum cover. For whatever reason, when I was looking at these images, this style binding with the screws must be really trendy right now, because everything you see has these screws in it. And I don't know that that's a good idea. There was a while where it was kind of trendy to bolt your portfolio together or whatever, and then we went away from that for a long time. And apparently this screw hinge thing is now really in. I don't necessarily condone it, but that's the trend. So be aware, look online, see what you think, and see if it seems relevant to you. Right? Another example here, I show you this just because it's kind of cool. They laser cut an acrylic cover. So the white acrylic is then cut out with the laser cutter for the person's name, and that then shines through to whatever's below it. So you can certainly do it as a cutout combination like that. And it can be a really neat effect. There was a time back in probably 2009 where I actually required people to laser cut covers as part of this class. We went away from that and do the laser cut in 136. But it can be kind of a creative strategy. So it's certainly something to be aware of, and some of the examples back there might have laser cut covers. The abstract shape background, right? It would be nice if you actually created whatever this background was, right? If it's a photograph, you take the photograph. If it's this kind of a pattern, you create the pattern, right? If you just go online and find a pattern and stick it behind your work, it's a portfolio of your work. It's not right to have the cover be someone else's image. Does that make sense? So you would want to be careful about what you're picking. Now, I have to pick on this one a little bit, and I have no idea who these people are. And if they end up watching the YouTube video, I'm sorry if I'm picking on you, but it is what it is. Okay? So look right there. Okay? This is similar to the little cross that I showed you in the first one, right? It absolutely bugs me that it's not even. Right? Do you see that? There's more space right there than there is on this side. Drives me nuts. Right? So I'm telling you this because, remember, I'm responsible for grading your portfolio. Right? I don't like this stuff. Be consistent. Make sure spacing is even. Yeah?
Are you saying there's more space between the line and the first letter and on the bottom of the line and the last letter?
No, I'm saying there. Here, let me clear this again. If right in here, the space between this line and the P is bigger than the space between the E right there, the space on this side. The two spaces there aren't even. Furthermore, this H doesn't line up with the P. Right? So those are they're little details that can make or break it. Okay? Remember when you're talking about portfolio, in this class, okay, it's the first portfolio you ever did, in all likelihood. Are there going to be mistakes like this? Sure. Okay? But if you think about you're applying to grad school or something where the portfolio really matters, okay, let's use the grad school example because this will sink in a little bit better. Okay, so you're applying to grad school at Berkeley. There's a total of 15 spots that they're going to let people in. So there's only 15 people. There's 3,000, 5,000 applicants for those 15 spots. Okay? The people that are reviewing your portfolio all have design backgrounds, right? All care about design, are all extremely passionate about design. If they see this on the cover, are they going to want to look at it? No, it's going to bug them. Okay? If it bugs me, trust me, it'll bug them. So these are the kinds of details that you want to make sure are right. You go in for a job interview, and they say, let me see your portfolio. Okay? If you have these kinds of mistakes on the cover, that's not the attention to detail they're looking for. So you just want to be aware. Okay? So I'm sorry for picking on whoever Hisham is. I don't know. Sorry for picking on him. All right, another example here. This is the concrete grunge texture background, right, with the slight overlay of portfolio. It feels like the letters are a little crammed together, right? It's like you took the letters and you just to them. And so maybe that's desirable or not. I'm not sure. Okay, but it's certainly something that they chose to do. That's what it looks like. With the background. Can't see it on the board. Anyway. Weird. Yeah, so anyway, there's supposed to be a background here, but you guys can't see it on the projector. Anyway, this is, I like this example because it's architecture, but it's also urban design and city planning mixed in. So having the Noli Plan of Rome backdrop, sorry, I'm holding this up because it looks better than that. Having the Noli Plan of Rome, the cityscape in the background kind of makes sense for this. All right? Very creative use of fonts and kind of how the outlines work. And I don't know, I like that architecture portfolio. The image is kind of bizarre, right? It's kind of unique in its own way with the shadows and whatever, but it's also kind of bizarre. I think this would work better as a web page than it would as a cover to a portfolio. But certainly an option. This one is a full spread, so you have to imagine it sliced in the center and folded, so you have a front and a back. Why there's a barcode on it, I'm not really sure, but that must somehow be part of the trend in what he was trying to set up. Okay? Another example here with the silhouette of the cityscape with architectural portfolio. Not quite sure what the lines represent and why they're there. Okay? It appears to be kind of trendy to do this. Another example, different city, there's the lines again. I don't know about the lines, right? But it is certainly something that you could choose to do as well. We looked at Alex Holgreff's work last time, so I wanted to bring one of these back. He has a pretty good write-up on his trial runs through his covers and figuring out what the right cover was and how many different variations he needed to go through. It's not uncommon to have to do lots of covers to figure out the right one. Remember, a cover is fundamentally the first thing somebody sees on your portfolio. Right? That's what they look at first. It's how you represent yourself. It's how you get somebody interested in looking at what's inside. So you want to be careful about that. That's the unfolded version of it. If you're doing a front and back, obviously you have to think about it as a whole piece and how it wraps around. So then we move into, we had the abstract backgrounds. Now we move into the somehow related to your work background. Right? So this is a project that I did. I'm going to use that piece of the project, that rendering, that drawing, that sketch, as a background image for the cover of my portfolio. And one of the risks of doing this as part of the cover is you're giving up your work early, right? That great rendering, it's shown twice in your portfolio, because you don't want to not show it when it comes to that project. So you have to be kind of aware of that and how it fits into the overall scheme of things. This was a laser cut one on wood, again with those screws. Trendy. Right? I thought this one was really well done. Right? Great typography, good font choice, how it goes together is nice, clean, it's centered, and then we have this really detailed little sketch. And I think it tells a lot about who the person is, what their process is, and what their abilities are, just by that cover. And so that can be a strategy. Right? I would argue that this isn't really giving anything away for the inside. But it's telling you something about how this person works and that they like to sketch and that they're good at sketching and that sort of thing. A little piece here, a little bit over, they took the rendered image and they made it too white, so there's just little bits of shadow, and that works fairly nice. They're also talking about materials, light and landscape, showing the image at the bottom has a lot to do with light and shadow, so it kind of makes sense. Right? This is certainly abstract, but it's probably related to some kind of a drawing model that this person did. And I don't know the person or the work, so it's hard to say, but it's a nice background. Right? Different example here, the oversaturation of red. If red continued as a theme through the portfolio, it might be nice. To me, it's a little like angry. Remember we talked about color theory, and it's a very dominant color, and I don't know that this much of it on your cover is necessarily the right choice. I think this one's really nicely done, kind of an overlay of the sketching with the photographic backgrounds and the tracing paper, and then a very clean piece of text. Right? So it kind of works nicely as part of the layering. The projected image, you really don't see as much of the yellow trace that's in the actual image. This is the full rendering of somebody. Putting that as your cover image, certainly it can work just very nicely. You just want to be careful about showing the same thing twice. And is that a good strategy or not? Another example here. Okay, then we can move into and I don't have too many of these, the model background. So the thing that you made, the physical model, and using that as a background. And it's usually a high contrast black and white, the little piece. The thing you have to be careful with on these kinds of images is your model really of quality that you want to show it in this kind of place? right? So this one's pretty good. There's a little tiny error in the glue joint right there that kind of, could be a little cleaner. So if you're really good at building models, it might be something that you want to show. It might be something for later on. It can work or it cannot work. It just depends on your particular piece. Compositionally, this one's great. You have a nice strong diagonal. You have this piece that offsets that piece, and they work nicely together. So I think it ends up being a very strong piece. Another example here, photographic. This must have been done with some kind of a CAD/CAM router or something like that. But it's kind of an interesting three-dimensional cover. Then we move into the cutouts. These are the laser cut pieces. The acrylic with the person cut out with the engraving. They can be a really nice strategy for creating a complex, interesting cover. You obviously have to think carefully about what's on the next page because you're seeing from one page into the next page. And you have to make sure that that part of the color works. So let's talk a little bit about binding options and how are you going to bind your portfolio. The simplest way, and what most people in this class tend to do, is to jump right into the traditional bindings that are available from Staples, Office Max, FedEx, Kinko's, those kinds of places, right? Those are not the nicest options in the world, but they're certainly functional and they work. There's two primary kinds. Oops. The first one is a spiral binding, right, which you're obviously familiar with. It's plastic. The thing you have to be careful of, and I need to get a photographic example of this, is when you open a two-spread spiral-bound piece, one side goes down because of the spiral and one side goes up. So if you have something that's supposed to align across two pages, it won't. It'll be offset by at least 1/8 of an inch. And I can show you an example in the back on one of them. So if you have something that goes across spreads and you use a spiral, that alignment's going to be off, and it's something that you want to be aware of, right? The alternative to that would be a comb binding, which will keep them in alignment. Okay, so if this is great for one-sided portfolios, everything's on one side of the page, the back side is blank, you don't have to worry about that alignment issue. Okay, this and the comb binding both take up about 1/4 of an inch of your document because you have that row of holes going down the side, right? So if we look right here, right, see all those holes that are punched through your document, right? That distance is about 1/4 of an inch out from the edge of the page. So if you put something like a photograph or something in there, when you go and have it bound and they drill all the holes through your document, you lose a significant percentage of your work. So you want to be aware that you're going to lose stuff in the center. Sometimes with a photograph or something, it doesn't really matter. But if you were showing something critical, some lines or something that you really wanted to show, and they get cut off, you have to be aware of that. So the other option, right, there's another spiral. Other option would be comb binding. And it looks very, oops, the picture's wrong, sorry. That's the comb binding, my mistake. But let's talk about comb binding. So ignore the picture, right here. No picture. Okay. It can be metal or it can be plastic. Okay. The plastic ones tend to be really chunky. They're thick. The little tabs are really thick, and they just don't look good. Okay. The metal ones are thinner, and they tend to look a little bit better. Right? It depends on where you go as to whether it's metal or plastic, and you kind of have to ask ahead. You have no alignment issues. When you open the spread, they're going to be the same. Going across the page, all your flow lines and your images are going to be there. But it is, just like the spiral, going to take about 1/4 inch out with the holes for the binding itself. So we can look at some examples. There's far more examples on these comb bindings than there are of the spiral bindings related to architectural portfolios. So you can see these are kind of like you have your sketchbook or whatever. It's those metal combs. But they can work nicely, and they can look nice. Right, another example there. There's an example of page to page. The alignment stays the same across the two pages. But there's, again, all of the little holes, right, running down the page. If you had text going to that point, it would get punched out. You'd lose the text. So you want to be aware of those things. Right? Another example here. Right? This one's nice because the metal is a little bit thicker, And so you have to shop around and see what the metal binding looks like and how thick it is. One of the things that can happen if the metal's too thin, I think there's a few examples in the back, is it can be kind of floppy. It's not a rigid spine. It's much more flexible. And so you have to be aware of that as well. Then we get into the handmade or the specialty bindings. And it's not uncommon for people to want to do something special, to bind it themselves, to spend the extra time. When I did my grad school portfolio, I bound it myself because I couldn't find the binding that I wanted, right? Now there's a lot of online publishers that if you anticipate enough in advance, you can send it out and have somebody publish it for you and come back. They have professional, nice-looking bindings. You guys won't have enough time. You won't finish in enough time to actually do that. So it's not really an option to send it out to an online print house, but you can make your own, right? And the process of making your own generally involves glue, some thread, right? Maybe some staples covered up by other things, and you kind of hybridize and make up your own binding. This is a pretty good example for how it works. So you take the individual pages, and in this particular case, they glued it and sewed it, but you could do this with a little staple. And then they essentially left, let's see if I can draw this well, they left a flap that comes out. It's about halfway. Then they took the cover and they glued it to that flap. And then as the cover comes around, they're going to glue the cover to this side. So it ends up folding over itself and making the thick cover. And then it wraps around the binding, and then the same thing happens on the back side. Right? So it's just an extra long sheet of paper, Bristol or something like that, and then they cut it and glue it on. Another example here shows you what the binding can look like. One of the things that's interesting is I was looking for images of binding, especially for architectural portfolio, and everybody shows their cover, but generally when you print it online, you make an export from InDesign, here's my cover, or from Illustrator, and they never talk about what the binding actually is. In the examples in the back, I've started probably the last 2 or 3 years of classes. I ask everybody to put a sticky note in the back that says where they had it bound, how much it cost, and that sort of thing. So because people would ask me, well, where was this one bound? I was like, I don't know. So now that it's in the back, so you can look in the back of a lot of the portfolios and see. But you can see how clean this style binding can look because you don't have the spirals anymore, right? And if my grad school one's still there, I can show you how I ended up doing it. Kind of along these lines, where you take the piece of cardboard, you make a little slit, and you glue that end together and make the binding. This was something that I hadn't seen before. It's a special Japanese, it's kind of like a paper clip, where you drill a hole in 2 places, and then the wire wraps around and binds it together. It's kind of neat, but you could do that yourself, right? With a little hole through your piece. There's another example of the spine when it's kind of professionally printed, where it actually wraps around and becomes a book. Right? Another example with the creativity of kind of how things are folded and stapled together. Okay, so that's it for the slide examples. I'm going to walk into the back and show you a few things in the actual portfolios that are there. And again, I encourage you today to spend some time and look at these because it'll start to become really clear. There's a lot of spiral binds back here. People tend to use the spirals, I think because they're the cheapest option. Okay? But you can look at them and see how they line up. This one is a good example because, like I said, remember, they don't line up anymore, so it's all one-sided. So it works nicely for the spiral. Okay? Let's see if I can find one that has something that flows across the page. That's obvious. That's all one-sided. Looks like most people took my advice, and all the spirals are... Let's see. Bear with me for a second. There we go. Knew I'd find one. Right? See the line that goes across? See how it doesn't match up? Right, that's what I'm talking about on these. Okay, so you want to be aware of that. Can you manually kind of tweak it to try to make it closer? Yes, but somebody who's looking at your portfolio isn't going to actually do that. Okay, they're gonna say, oh, there it is, and then it doesn't line up anymore. Okay, so just be aware. I'm trying to make a point. You guys get my point about these? Okay, there's another binding here that some of the office supply stores do, the plastic isn't the most attractive, but it's more of a book style. And so you don't end up with all the holes in it. It reads a little bit more like a book, and obviously things line up across a page just fine. I do have an example here of somebody who laser cut the cover and used a thicker cover. That can work, but again, you have to be careful about what is below it in your little stack. So let's see here. Do I have my... Some of these have a tendency to walk away. Trying to think. Nope, I don't have my grad school one. I'll dig around in my office and see if it's still there. But I was going to show you how I did that binding. So go ahead and take some time, look at the examples again. As far as I know, every portfolio that's back there did get an A. So I tried to cull out anything that didn't get A's on it so that you would be aware of it. So today, for exercise 128, you're going to want to start working on your cover, and then also spend time to bring in the other pieces that you've been working on for the last semester into your portfolio and start to see how they assemble and how that portfolio works. The reason that I devote a whole day to coming back to it is so that you don't forget about it, right? We're going to go back into SketchUp after Thanksgiving. We'll do, we did plans, so we'll do elevations, we'll do perspectives. We'll talk more about bringing in the collaging and Photoshop and that sort of thing. Yeah? So the laser cutting's here, the laser cutter's here. And if that's something you really want to do, we can talk through kind of how to do it. The binding places, most people end up either binding it themselves or going to one of the traditional Staples, Office Max, Office Depot, Kinko's, FedEx, whatever it's called now, UPS store, those kinds of places. But that's also why I ask everybody to put a sticky note in the back, and I'll give you sticky notes on the last day of class to tell future people who are looking at your portfolio where it was bound. There's a few back here. There's one that Alex Davies did probably in 2008-ish. That's still one of the, it's a really good portfolio. This one, I've been asked where he had it bound many, many times. I have no idea. So that's why I started asking people to put in the backs, where they had it bound. And not everybody does it. Here, there was a sticky note on the front of this one. So this was at FedEx. It was printed at school. It was bound at FedEx, and it cost $18. Okay. This one here. Here's a good example. So this one was printed in the school lab for about $5, and she hand sewed the binding together with thread, and it's really nicely done. Right? It's subtle, but the binding holds up. And it works nicely as a little book. Okay, so it's certainly an option, and that was $5 to do. Okay, so this is not, your grade is not dependent on how much money you spent on the printing. Okay, one of the things about, and you'll notice when you look through it, there's different papers that people choose to print on, right? Sometimes they're glossy, sometimes they're semi-gloss, sometimes they're thicker, sometimes they're thinner. If they're printing back and front, that can make a difference, right? What? What do I personally like? Yeah. Depends on what you're trying to do. It can be really nice as matte. It can be really nice as glossy. It can be really nice as semi-gloss. It depends on the look and what the colors are. And that's why I would look through these different examples, because some of them are glossy, some of them are matte, and you can get a sense for what you like. Right? It's really a portfolio is very much a personal reflection of you. So if I were up here saying, you have to do it in glossy, that's not necessarily who you are and what feels right for your work. Because it's your portfolio, you have to make that call. So anyway, there's the examples for you to look at. Today, spend your time working on your portfolio, revisiting it. I'm expecting a cover as your image today for your exercise 128. And then we'll go back into SketchUp again toward the end of the semester. Okay? You will end up with a little bit of time, I believe, at the end to keep working on your portfolio. We'll spend some more days, but this is the last official lecture on portfolios. Okay? Are there any questions? No. For the portfolios? We can sit down and I can talk through it. Yeah.